How did you become interested in singing early music?
Well, I loved music from the time that I was really little, and it's interesting, my favorite music was Mozart opera and Baroque chamber music, so Brandenburg Concerti and things. I hadn't really investigated Baroque vocal music terribly much, but when I went to Eastman as a voice major, which was a little bit odd considering I wasn't so convinced that I wanted to be a singer, I came into contact with a wonderful gentleman named Eric Schwant, a harpsichordist, who had studied at Stanford University, and he had a class in the history of the symphony, and he asked everyone to bring their instrument to class. And the purpose of the class was to have everybody trill, so the tuba players looked very cautious about this, but attempted to trill on the tuba. And after I did my trill, he said, "I'd like to see you after class, please." And I thought, oh my word, what have I done now? How could I have gone so wrong? And he said, after class, he said, "I think that your voice is very well suited for Baroque music, and with your permission, I would like to take you under my wing as my private student, and we'll have 4-hour sessions every weekend." And at first thought I was just a little taken aback by this. This was a lot of extra attention from a faculty member, but in fact that's exactly what happened. I got training in the French Baroque agréments, which are the ornaments of French 18th century, from this fellow, very in detail, in depth, on subsequent weekends, so that then we started presenting concerts at Eastman. So from a fairly early age I got some in-depth training, and one thing led to another, and I realized that that's where I was best suited.
This is at a time when that early music was really sort of coming into vogue, about maybe 10 years ago or something, where there really weren't a lot of recordings of early music, and some of the ones that were out were pretty bad. So was this part of this sort of renaissance of the Renaissance, if you will?
I'd say it was. Certainly, by this time already in Europe, Harnoncourt had begun making his Bach cantata series, and the things that he was espousing began to put early music on the map. So after my years at Eastman, I went to Austria to study with him, and had, when I look back on it, really incredible in-depth sessions with an extremely busy and active musician at that time. He was really booked for 7 years in advance, yet took the time to have 3 or 4 days a week of 4 or 5 hour sessions with students of Baroque music. And it's so interesting, from the class that I was in, almost everybody to a person is now a serious recording artist in Baroque music. So he had a terrific influence, and I was lucky to be among the group of people that got that attention because he had the time. He made the time for us then.
You've sung music, recorded music, ranging from the Italian Renaissance, English Renaissance, to Bach and Telemann. Do you have a favorite composer, favorite period of time?
Well, I guess I could say that the Italian 17th century provides for me the dramatic outlet that I would like. I think particularly of some of the repertoire that is presented on the newest release from Dorian, Music of Love and War. Not only does it offer opportunity for fast vocal passages, but also for dramatic expression. And one might name then the Giovanni Felice Sanchez pieces, the Passacaglia and Chacan, or the Amarilli that is presented in its ornamented version on that, as just examples of the kind of vocalism that a singer might be expected. Also, even though Bach is very instrumental and intricate and challenging to sing, he treats the voice as an instrument, and one has to suppress a certain amount of maybe healthy singer expression in presenting Bach. And the Italian Baroque gives the singer that expression, those possibilities for expression. Lucrezia, for example, is an extremely violent, in terms of emotions, kind of text. And the singer has to consider very carefully how to work from this initial shock that the character Lucrezia has after having been raped, to this hellfire and damnation little scene that comes just before she dies. It's really you can kind of picture that she's almost dead, and then her eyes just fly open, and she presents this incredible curse, saying she'll come back from the dead. And even though Bach will deal with serious texts like damnation and things like that, he doesn't do it in a way that is dramatic for the singer. It's still very instrumental.
Could you talk a little bit about the difference between singing early music and, say, music of the 19th or 20th century, or maybe specifically at the point where there is some overlap, say Bach, for example, how you would approach it as different from a singer trained in bel canto tradition, for example?
Well, it is fascinating to realize that for centuries in Italy, and I say Italy, if you'll forgive me to just single out that country, because most of Europe danced a pretty fast jig to whatever the Italians did, so Europe followed suit. Russia and England, everybody but France really was involved in the Italian method of teaching singing. And the things that were emphasized in that were the ability to sustain pitches, the strengthening of the breath through sustaining long pitches, and conversely, the strengthening of the agility or the practice of the agility. So those were the two main features. And in the agility, one, of course, includes the trill and coloratura passages, basically the way our notes are articulated. By contrast, 20th century voice teachers have a tendency not to pay much attention to the agility. They work extensively on the sustain because it's what's needed for Puccini opera, it's what's needed for the world of grand opera, if we will accept from that Verdi and Rossini. A lot of grand opera, Wagner certainly, there's no coloratura in Wagner, except perhaps in one of the very earliest pieces he wrote. So it's not a skill that is sought after, but I believe that it is a skill, that the balance in the voice of this technical virtuosity and the sustain is essential for health in the voice. And it brings to mind in Beverly Sills' book, she talks about being kind of in vocal tatters, a time when she had laryngitis, and she went to her voice teacher and they worked doing the trill, nothing but the trill for an hour, and afterwards her laryngitis had disappeared. So it kind of supports the need, I think, for flexibility in the voice. Another thing that differs is how the degree to which a singer is likely or prone to slur notes. In the 18th century, a portamento, basically the word portamento, is the good use of the voice, or if you will, proper vocal carriage. It came to have much more general meanings than the one we associate most with it, which is connecting notes fluidly and with a tiny, and I say tiny bit of slur. For example, if one is going from maybe a G to an E flat, the portamento would take place only right below the E flat, not as a glissando all the way from the G. And a portamento in 19th century or 20th century singing is generally a much thicker, heavier kind of a slur. More notes are involved. The interval, though it be the same, might have as part of its portamento, or the slur part, as much as a third or a fourth even. So that's another instance in which it's different. Certainly the ambitus of vibrato is different, although I dare say singers in the 18th century certainly acknowledged vibrato. They probably trained their voices without much vibrato at the beginning because of the need. There was a term called the fermare della voce, and that means the steadying of the voice, although literally in Italian it means to stop the voice. I've never known a singer who had trouble stopping the voice, except in terms of not shutting up when they need to be quiet. But in any case, this was the first step. You studied the long sustain, and then when you could master that without much fluctuation of pitch, then you practiced the mezza di voce, which was a crescendo decrescendo, and often at the peak of the crescendo the vibrato would be introduced. and then taken out again as the decrescendo occurred. So singers had a lot of control of their vibrato. They also had techniques which used different kinds of vibrato. One was a pulsation from the diaphragm, kind of like whoo, and it was used especially in affective places, like on the word lagrime or piangere, lagrime meaning tears and piangere to cry. So there's a wonderful cantata by Strozzi, Barbara Strozzi, that begins so you get this pulsation, which sounds like crying. And it's a different kind of vibrato than is normally used. So I guess what I'd say is modern voice teachers have a tendency to want to have the beautiful sound all of the time. And they seek to find it, and once they found it, they don't let it go. So the idea is you make that beautiful sound on every note of the phrase, of the piece, of the opera. You want the beautiful sound. Little consideration is made of making different beautiful sounds, or maybe even a sound that today we wouldn't consider totally beautiful. Maybe a voice teacher hearing that sound that I just made would say, well, that's too wide a vibrato, and would ignore the affective use of that kind of vibrato to depict tears and crying. But that would not have been the case in the 18th century. They looked for as many means of expression as they could find for the representation of the text, and that's why I guess I love the Italian Baroque so much, and particularly the 17th century. Singers were expected to depict in whatever way they could the words.
I think the most obvious thing when I listen to the way you sing and the way perhaps an opera singer sings is so much more of a pure tone. Many times people who didn't grow up listening to classical music, for example, will say that opera singers sound artificial. The way they produce sounds, it sounds very affected, very mannered in that. But yet the way you sing, it just seems so pure without any affectation whatsoever. Obviously, there's the interpretation, but it just seems it's just such a pure, beautiful tone.
Well, I think one thing about early music singing is that it seems to be speech-derived whenever it can be, so that the vibrato is not on every note. It would be foolish to say that I don't sing with vibrato, because I do, but I do not have the ambitus of vibrato that modern opera singers have had to develop, and I believe out of a sense of self-defense, because the halls that they are asked to sing in are so huge. Like the San Francisco Opera House is an immense barn, and that's just one of many opera houses like that in the world. If I might use the analogy, it's exactly what one does in an earthquake building. You build give and take. You build it so that instead of breaking, the structure will bend or will have a certain amount of give in it. I think similarly one can liken the voice to this, in that in a hall like that, to put out the volume needed, there needs to be a certain amount of relaxation, and the vibrato provides the antidote to the volume in terms of keeping the voice able to work. And certain voices, I think should I have tried to push my voice much greater than the volume that I have, I probably would have been one of those who was damaged in the process. There are other voices that are just naturally very big, and then there are other voices still who are kind of borderline and who will push for the big sound and nonetheless get somewhat damaged in the process of the training or the pushing or taking on roles that are too extensive, that extend them too much. I'd like to say just something about the kind of glottal technique that is often used in some of the earlier repertoire. When I'm thinking particularly of the English lute song and of a piece, Nothing on Earth, which has it's really a division piece for the voice. It's written over a Galliard bass and slowed down because the divisions are outrageous there in 30-second notes, and a non-stop. It's a kind of piece that leaves you with your mouth hanging open because you can't. It's not a great piece of music. It's an impressive piece of music. It has to use a kind of technique that enables one to sing very fast, and it involves less than, I would say, the use of the entire volume of the voice. Some singers call it singing off the voice, but it is in fact what enables somebody like Marilyn Horne. She might not acknowledge this, but I believe she has a kind of two separate technical tracks that she can operate on. When she's singing forte and singing sustained, she uses her entire vocal mechanism. When she is singing a Rossini passage of extreme agility, she has the ability to go to that lighter mechanism of glottals so that the notes are absolutely clear and lightning fast, but probably not quite as loud as her full voice. And that's a technique that I think I use, although I don't have the track that she does of the extreme volume, in a performance of something like Nothing on Earth, or in The Merry Pleasant Spring, which begins the lute song, the English lute song recording from Dorian.
You were telling me that there's a great deal of difference between 17th century vocal technique and 18th century vocal technique. Could you explain that a little more?
Well, maybe I should correct myself. There are definite differences. I wouldn't say that it's the world of difference between that and the 20th century, but one of the ways in which the 18th century changed was that they stopped approving of that glottal technique. They called it by derisive names. They called it zgagateata, which is an onomatopoeic word representing the way a chicken cackles after laying an egg. I mean, that's the idea. That kind of clucking, they felt, and were correct in feeling, did not carry very far. If you were in a large room or in an opera house, it was not as effective as if you were in a small salon, where perhaps a singer would be singing for a group of 10 people in close and fairly intimate circumstances. In the opera house, they felt that it just did not work so well. So they devised a kind of articulation. They actually described 4 in all. They made fun of this gagateata. The next kind, which seems to be the most popular kind, was called detached, both in Italian and in German treatises of the time. And the detached kind of articulation, which was the most popular in the 18th century, was not quite so glottal, but nonetheless mandated a repronouncing of the vowel on every note, as opposed to the next, if you will allow me to go just a bit further, the next kind being slurred, which had one vowel on which all of the notes were to be pronounced. And I'll try to give an example if I can. Zgagateata, or the glottal articulation of the 17th century, is something like ha 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 ha. It's very, very light, very fleet, and modern singers would say off the voice. An example of detached might be this little section from La Lucrezia of Handel, which is Questi la dispera, which is much more slurred, a lot more, well, I'm using the word slurred, but it's a lot more legato, shall we say, than the first thing I did. And then the more slurred kind presented only one vowel on a series of notes, so without that being detached. And lastly, there was a very extreme kind of slurring that they called the drag in English, lo strascino in Italian, das Ziehen in German. And it's interesting, you'll find the word das Ziehen or Ziehen in Bach cantatas in a way that I believe should be pretty heavily slurred. One thinks of the aria from the St. John Passion, Ich folge dir gleichfalls. There's a section in Chromaticism, Ziehen zu bieten, and I believe that the strascino, or the Ziehen, was meant to be extremely slurred, in fact a glissando kind of effect. So among notes of a half step or a whole step, you'd get la la a real strong slur. It occurs, that by the way, occurs with great frequency in music of the 17th century. You'll find it in Monteverdi. No one does it because they don't realize what it is. It's an enharmonic note, written B flat, for example, to B natural, and with a slur mark over it. And that, to the 17th century singer, said, make a glissando. And nobody does it because we don't know what it means. They just think, what's the slur here for? It doesn't make any sense. But I think once you start looking, if you become aware of how much the singer was expected to express the text, and you start looking for ways to do it, it's curious how you'll find in the pedagogical literature of the time support for these kind of special effects.
How do you go about choosing the material that you record? Some of the productions with orchestras and such things like that are probably planned out in advance, but when you make solo recordings, how do you go about choosing what material will go on a recording?
Well, that's not too hard to answer. In the past, I've just picked my favorite pieces, which is fair enough, I guess. But it is interesting. I'm being pressed to come up with new recording ideas, and I must say, lately I've started to do some research on the music of Sigismondo d'India, who I think is brilliant, a brilliant writer in that Italian dramatic style I was discussing earlier. Also, I've been asked to expand my horizons a bit the other direction, and will likely do this year a recording of Beethoven folk songs, those wonderful arrangements that were done in the 18th century.
Music off which he made most of his living, as we understand it.
That is right. In fact, one of the tunes I learned to my surprise the other day, one of the Irish tunes that he was asked to arrange ends up being the last movement of the Beethoven 7th Symphony. I had no idea that was an Irish tune, but it is unmistakably drawn from that collection. I had no idea he borrowed quite like that. It was my first awareness, I guess.
What was the name of that?
Oh, I can't think of it right now. I can tell you where to find it. There's the BBC put out a series on video called The Symphony, and Andre Previn makes reference to that theme as one used by Beethoven in his symphony as coming from the Irish folk songs that he was asked to arrange. I guess, yes, so I am looking forward to doing a recording of Beethoven folk songs with piano and cello and forte piano. Also, Mozart Lieder. I'm not sure if I just mentioned that or not. No. And even Mendelssohn, if you can believe it. It's Schubert. So in terms of Lieder, that's not too hard to consider, because that is later repertoire. It becomes a little more dicey if one involves the larger orchestral pieces, because I don't think, or I wonder if my voice could have the weight at this point that would be necessary for that sort of thing.
Will you change your style of singing for the later music? Will you employ more vibrato, for example?
Well, I think some, but I still am always looking for ways to paint the text, and I think a lieder singer must do that. It's one of the distressing things that the art of lieder singing has fallen a bit by the wayside, because opera singers are the ones that are recognized names, and therefore they do the lieder recitals, but in a very operatic fashion. I would like to mention a terrific exception, though. I played for a class recently, Jessie Norman's Erlkönig, and she depicts the boy's voice and this horrible thing, the Earl King, and the father's voice, all so clearly that my class asked if it were sung by the same person. And she had the conviction and the goods to deliver a performance that was that differentiated. I thought that was really a wonderful thing. But in general, that is needed in lieder singing, not the continuous bella voce. We need to paint the words. And in Mozart, you have several instances in his well-known lieder, in fact, of sighing and crying places, where you can use some of these earlier techniques, and what it does is it heightens the word. It makes the listener say, what was that? Why did she do that? There must be a reason in the text. They check the text, and the word becomes important. It stands out. And that's necessary to do lieder. You have to treat it as an intimate experience and make it come alive that way.
You're in town right now to make a recording, some Bach cantatas. Can you tell us a little about that?
Yes, I'd like for the Bay Area to know about the American Bach Soloists, which is a group based in Marin County at St. Stephen's Church in Belvedere. And due to the support, wonderful support of a small group of people in Marin, a series has been put together for 2 years. It's in its second year now, of recording and performing Bach cantatas with original instruments. And not only is it an accumulation of some of the best practitioners of the early music movement in this country, assembled here in San Francisco, but the products will then be released soon on the label Wild Boar, which is located in Berkeley at the shop. I can't think of the name of it.
The Musical Offering. Joseph Spencer, who does the Chapel Court and Countryside program on Monday nights.
Right. He has a store in Berkeley and his own label, the Wild Boar. And this is hoped will attract the attention which this wonderful group deserves, and likewise the funding and the support from the community at large, which it deserves because of its very specialized and extraordinary nature. Run by a person who's lived in Bay Area and in New York City, Jeffrey Thomas, well-known tenor to early music lovers in this area, I am sure.
He's performed here many times with the Philharmonia Baroque Orchestra and a number of organizations around the area.
That's right, and we are recording Cantata 51, which is Jauchzet Gott in allen Landen. That's a soprano cantata with trumpet and strings, and in fact about an hour from now, and Cantata 55, which is a Bach solo cantata for tenor and orchestra. And that will be the second of the CDs to be issued on this label.
You have some new recordings of Handel coming out later on this year. Tell us about that.
Well, one is a reissue, which should be out by Thanksgiving, of Imeneo. It was the last opera that Handel wrote, and it was issued a few years ago by Vox, and Vox went into bankruptcy court, so the record barely was out before it was not out. And luckily for everybody concerned, it will soon be issued in a way that will make it readily available. That will be again for Vox, although they have a new label now. I can't tell you exactly what it will be called, Elite or something. Another Handel opera, Siroe, never previously recorded, will be coming out within about 2 months of that, January, we're hoping, for Newport Classics. Once again, the first recording of this Handel opera, and I'm getting to recreate the role of Faustina sang. Faustina was Johann Adolf Hasse's wife and was in her own right probably the most famous singer of her day, with a kind of a mezzo-soprano range and very, very easy coloratura. And the music that Handel wrote for her somehow just seems to fit like a glove. And so I'm very excited about that coming out. We are also presenting it November 1st in New York City as a premiere performance, too. It's been sold out for a long time. And then La Serva Padrona, a recording of Pergolesi with original instruments. The group playing in the orchestra then is Philomel. And then basically I'm awaiting 2 Handel releases, one from Meridian Records of solo cantatas, continuo cantatas, and another one from Dorian, which is cantatas with instruments such as Tra le fiamme and Nel dolce dell'oblio and other kind of chestnuts that people love to hear. So that's coming out, I don't know, probably a year from now, likely. But there are several Handel recordings on the way. And Joshua, I forgot to mention, the Oratorio Joshua, which also has never been recorded, is also due for release in 1991.
That's a lot of music to look forward to, and I hope you'll come back and tell us all about it sometime.
Well, thanks so much. It was a pleasure being here.